I grew up I grew up identifying strongly with Israel as a Jewish person, and really understood the narrative, the Zionist narrative, as one of this miraculous renewal, miraculous national renewal after the horrible cataclysm of the Holocaust. The Jewish people were reborn in their ancient homeland, uh, and in this political national revival, and felt like many Jews very fortunate to be alive to experience that. It's a very compelling, it's a very powerful narrative. And I wasn't taught many other aspects of the history of Zionism and the circumstances of the establishment of the state of Israel. I uh, visited Israel many times. I took time off from college and spent 2 years there. And, like many Jews, even today, kind of lived this hermetically sealed experience where I lived in Jewish Israel, but had very little to do with Palestinians. Um, and, I think over the years, I began to ask questions. And over the years, there were certain questions that did not have ready answers, or at least if they did, they were very painful. So, one of the questions I think that I always entertain one way or another is how can you have a state that is predicated on the identity of one particular group of people when there are many people who belong to other groups who are living, who have historically and currently live in that land? I grew up in the United States, where we cherish, at least in the American community I grew up in, cherished diversity and saw that as a part of our strength, and was taught that to be part of this country meant to be part of a mosaic of many different peoples, and that all of us were created equally and granted equal rights under the Constitution. And yet in Israel, there was this kind of Jewish supremacist uh, mentality. It was an ethno state, essentially, a state that was predicated on the identity of one group of people. And as I tugged on those questions over the years, it led me to do more learning. It kind of coincided with the publishing of books by Israeli historians known today as the New Historians. In the 1980s, their works were translated into English. Historians like Ilan Pape and Avi Shlaim and Benny Morris, who looked at declassified military records to um, reveal that the circumstances of the creation of the state of Israel was founded upon the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes and villages and cities in Palestine, where many, if not most of them, lived for generations, and um, the the inability for them to return to them, to the refusal of the new state of Israel to allow them to return to their homes. So basically, it was a nation that was predicated on the dispossession of its indigenous peoples, which is, something that as Americans or any student of settler colonialism will know and understand. Except that as a Jew, I was taught something very different. I was taught that the Zionist movement always came in peace and wanted peace with the Arabs, but the Arabs were implacably opposed to a Jewish presence in Palestine and fought them until the burgeoning state of Israel, the Zionist movement, had no choice but to fight back. So, once I started going down this road and realizing the circumstances of of Israel's founding, it led to many, many different. I really started to accept this new narrative. I was already an adult. I was already a rabbi. I was always what I would call myself up until that point a liberal Zionist, which is a term that today I think is enormously problematic. I think it's a contradiction in terms. There's nothing liberal about ethno-nationalism. There's nothing liberal about granting one group of people rights over another. Again, we could trace a line to other forms of further colonialism, including here in the United States. Um, but I was always on kind of the left wing edge of Zionism. In other words, was always an advocate for a peace settlement and a two-state solution with the Palestinians, with the Palestinian people. Even I'm old enough to remember when even that suggestion was considered a radical thing in the United States and in the Jewish community. Um, so, you know, to bring my story to a close and get more into the larger subject that I wanted to talk to you about today, um, I eventually broke with Zionism in a very public way when I was in my former congregation, and this coincided with, or as was a result of, the Israel's onslaught on Gaza, military onslaught in 2008, 2009, which was known as Operation Cast Lead. There was between 2,000 and 3,000 people killed at the time. I just that felt like an ungodly amount of people. Little did I know what would happen several years later. And for me, that was kind of a final straw. It was the end of a process I had been leading up to kind of irrevocably. And I understood that this massacre of Palestinians was part of a long process that all the way back to the Nakba, the dispossession of Palestinians in 1948, and even earlier than that, and that there was an ongoing process of dispossession of Palestinians, by any means necessary. And I came to realize that when you found a state that's predicated on the identity of one people, people who are not part of that group are seen as an obstacle to statehood. They're seen as a problem to be dealt with. And I understood that finally. And so I very publicly said as much and broke with Zionism. I became very involved with Jewish Voice for Peace at that time. And it caused some consternation in my congregation, as you might imagine, but we managed to make it work uh, for several years after that. We worked hard to make it work. But I realize now, and this is the title of my talk, "The Growing Divide in the American Jewish Community." I was trying to hold together two sides that could not be held together. I was trying to straddle a fence that couldn't be straddled. And in 2014, on the occasion of another military onslaught on Gaza, uh, I was all the more public in my solidarity with the Palestinian people, very much more established um, in Jewish Voice for Peace, and ensconced in the Palestine solidarity movement in Chicago and nationally. That it just became untenable for me to stay in the congregation. It was too upsetting to some members of our congregation, and it did not allow me to be uh, uh, to stay. The atmosphere became too difficult. I couldn't do my job anymore. So that's when I left, and I did not think I would work again as a pulpit rabbi. I thought my career was over. Um, I started working for the American Friends Service Committee. Actually, I worked for the Quakers as their Midwest regional director. But together with some friends and some former congregants, started this new, informal Jewish gathering where we got together to celebrate Shabbat, the Sabbath, and festivals, just very informally, and that became the kernel for what eventually became a new congregation that was founded on very specific core values of standing in solidarity with the oppressed, including Palestinians, lifting up the liberatory traditions of Judaism and Jewish spiritual tradition, and being avowedly, first we called ourselves non-Zionist, and then a few years later changed that word in our core values to anti-Zionist. And I can talk about the difference between those two terms if people are interested. But that we stated very clearly in the community that we were founding, which is now 11 years old, that Zionism is an ideology that is rooted in Jewish supremacy. And as Jews committed to the core moral values of our tradition, which are that we stand with the oppressed, as it goes back to the all the way back to the Exodus story, one of our most sacred stories, and call out the oppressor, and that God is a God of liberation. That we break with Zionism, and so that's what I've been doing ever since. It's now my full-time job. I left AFSC in 2019, and I'm stepping down from the congregation next month. Actually, we're welcoming a new rabbi, full-time rabbi, and I'm stepping down. I'm not calling it retirement. I'm stepping down to devote more time to things like what I'm doing right now. Advocacy, activism, writing, organizing, um, etc. So uh, I think we are at a moment right now where we're seeing a very fundamental divide. I would even call it an abyss in the Jewish community, that I think is unbridgeable. I mentioned that when I was in my congregation, it was an unbridgeable divide. And I think right now, as we are coming up toward the third year now, which is uh, just astonishing to even say out loud, the third year of an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and in it has forced a reckoning in the Jewish community. And this is not a divide that started on October 7th. There have been fissures over the issue of Israel-Palestine in the Jewish community, going back to even uh, before the state of Israel was created. In fact, I'm finishing up a course that I'm teaching my congregation on Jewish anti-Zionism, and I've been teaching about different figures who were at the time part of the Zionist movement, but people who would today be considered anti-Zionist. And these are people who were advocating from within the Zionist movement the creation of a binational state, of a state that was governed equally by Palestinians and Zionist Jews. And there was a Zionist organization called Brit Shalom that was founded by many prominent intellectuals and public figures. Hannah Arendt, Martin Buber, Albert Einstein was associated with it. The Reform Rabbi Judah Magnus was one of the major people affiliated with it. Hans Kohn, the scholar of nationalism who ended up breaking with Zionism completely in 1929, was part of it, and they were advocating for a state of all its citizens up until 1948. In fact, if you go online and Google it, you can find an article that was written in Commentary Magazine. This is something that we read in our class, written by Hannah Arendt, the great political theorist and historian and journalist, who wrote an article in Commentary Magazine, and this was back when Commentary was an actual magazine that was actually quite left, which is hard to believe these days. Um, and it's entitled "To Save the Jewish Homeland." And if you just Google it, you'll find the article. And it was written in early 1948, where it looked like the partition plan was accepted, and there was increasing violence, and uh, things looked very, very dire. You know, that Britain was just pulling out unilaterally and leaving Palestine to the Zionists and the Palestinian Arabs who were living there, and the Nakba, frankly, was already underway. And she wrote this really powerful plea at the time, saying this is madness, that a Jewish nation state will eventually, if it gets founded, will be founded on the backs of another people, and will be the great Jewish cultural revival that we were seeking through Zionism, just subordinated to issue and just sheer physical survival at all cost. She wrote these words in 1948. Today they would be considered anti-Zionist, but at the time they were very much part of the Zionist fold. So Zionism is a relatively recent movement in Jewish history. The idea of creating national Jewish either state or homeland in historic Palestine. Before the onset of Zionism, uh, Jews lived in the diaspora and saw the diaspora as their home and did not advocate for a return to sovereignty in that land. That was something that only that could happen. That could only happen during the days of the Messiah. And Zionism was a radical overturning of everything it had meant to be Jewish up until that point. And then after the Holocaust, it became not just a, one of many Jewish movements of modernity, but it became hegemonic. It became a dominant uh, force in Jewish life. And then after the Nakba, oh, good, good. Thank you for posting. Um, uh, Zionism went from being one of many different uh, modern approaches to Judaism to being the dominant one, and it came at the cost of another people's well-being, to put it mildly. So, but my point is that these fissures, the opposition to Zionism, always existed. There were other Jewish movements. The Bund is another one. The Jewish Bund that arose in Eastern Europe. There's a new book written by Molly Crabapple that some of you may have heard of. Everywhere we live is our homeland. Um, it was an example of very, very passionate Jewish anti-Zionists who believed that we make our home everywhere and find common cause with other oppressed people everywhere we live in the world. The Reform movement before 1948 was anti-Zionist. So all of this to say that these fissures have always existed, but after 48, they were smoothed over to a certain extent, but never fully went away. There's always been a strain of opposition to Zionism in the Jewish community. I would say over the last few decades, there has been, according to every Jewish, uh, uh, community study, indications that support for the state of Israel in the Jewish community is waning. It's still the majority of the Jewish community considers itself Zionist, but since I would say the 1990s going forward, there's been an indication, particularly among the younger generations of Jews, a lack of identification with Israel, um, a a lack of identification with the ideology of Zionism, which since 1948, whatever Zionism, whatever diversity there might have been in the Zionist movement before 48, after the state of Israel, all of those differences became moot, and Zionism became Jewish political nation statism. The definition of Zionism that is meaningful today in the lives of real people in the real world that we live in is the creation and maintenance of a Jewish majority nation state in historic Palestine. That is what Zionism is. And there has been a growing opposition, particularly among younger Jews. But not only, I'm 63, I broke with Zionism in 2008. And we're seeing uh, those numbers radically uh, accelerating since October 7th, to the point where I believe that there is a genuine abyss in the Jewish community over this issue. Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization that I've been affiliated now with for some time, has been very, very actively involved in the Palestine solidarity movement, but as Jews. And we've held, we've been holding very public protests together with Palestinian allies um, since 2020, end of 2023, and I've participated in many of them in Washington, D.C., uh, in Grand Central Station. Recently, there was one in Midtown Manhattan outside the offices of New York Senators Gillibrand and Schumer there to support the bill that would ban aid to Israel. Um, there's been a very, very active Jewish presence since the beginning of the genocide in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And that speaks, I think, volumes about how far the Jewish community has come on this issue. Um, During the student encampment movement, before it was quashed by universities and by the current administration, there was a very, very visible Jewish presence on the student encampments. It happened in the spring of 2005, 2025 rather, and I'm sorry, 2024. And it happened, among other things, during Passover, and there were Passover seders on many of the college campuses, including Columbia University, which was the site of the first student encampment. I know this for a fact personally because I was involved in supporting the encampments at colleges and universities here in Chicago. Uh, Most predominantly DePaul University, University of Chicago, and Northwestern University, where the Jewish students were side by side with Palestinian students, with Muslim students, with other people, students of conscience, and they were creating, far from what was being characterized by universities and in the press as these bastions of anti-Semitism. They were actually the exact opposite. I twice led Shabbat services at an encampment at DePaul University. My congregation was invited to come to lead a Sabbath service. And when we got to the encampment, it was the most remarkable. This is not hyperbole. It was one of the most remarkable experiences I've had in recent memory. We had students coming together that were creating this universe of the world they want to live in. And they had their own food tent. They had a first aid station. They were doing de-escalation training. They had tutoring going on for people who were studying for tests. And then in the center quad, they had an ongoing program. When we got there, there was Muslims were praying. There was a call to prayer going on for the Muslim students. After that, there was an indigenous dance troupe that did a local indigenous dance troupe that performed. And then we led Shabbat. We led a Shabbat service after that. And there were students there wearing kippot, wearing yarmulkes, um, who were participating as Jews in this environment. It was not at all a bastion of anti-Semitism. If anything, it was a reflection of the world of sacred solidarity that all of these students wanted to create together. DePaul, like many of the other schools, was violently stormed by campus and city police, and all of that I just described to you was completely destroyed. So, on the one hand, we have these Jewish students and others like me who are supporting them as Jews, as part of the Jewish community, and on the other side, we have those who are standing with Israel, a nation that is perpetrating a literal genocide in this moment, who are accusing fellow Jews of anti-Semitism for supporting Palestinians who are the objects of this genocide. Um, I don't think that that's a bridgeable gap. I don't think in this moment that we can fall back on inclusivity. That's a word that we bandy about a great deal, and for good reason. I think the the very initials DEI includes the word inclusivity. Inclusivity is an important value when we're trying to create a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-group community. Inclusivity is enormously important, which inclusivity becomes an apologetic. It becomes an excuse to not take a stand. And there are some things where there can be no inclusivity. And I know that rubs many people the wrong way, particularly those of us, who have been involved in intergroup dialogue. it becomes very difficult to say, no, actually, there is no other hand. And, you cannot sit on the fence on certain issues. And in a time of genocide, and I believe that Jews of all people, well, not of all people, but Jews among many people should know this, that in a time of genocide, there is no other hand. You do not try to create a community that is inclusive of people who either support the country that's perpetrating it or remain silent over its crimes or say, well, it's kind of complicated, let's talk about it, on the one hand, and other Jews on the other hand who are saying, no, this is a genocide and we must do everything we can to stop it. And it's not just about the current government of Israel. It's about the very roots of this country itself, the ideology that it was founded on, which I discussed before, an ideology that is predicated on the Jewish, a majority of one group of people in the land over another. Um, I don't see how it's possible to create a wide tent in the Jewish community on this issue. And even, the Jewish community right now, if you look at um, the organizational context of our community, or if you look at synagogues and places of worship, um, there's very little common ground anymore. We have uh, Jewish organizations and synagogues that completely support what Israel's doing. We have those many that are just completely silent over it because they're wringing their hands and they don't know what to do, but they don't want to upset anybody, particularly those who are financial supporters of their organizations or synagogues. There are those who say, well, we have a wide tent on this issue, which means we have Zionists, we have non-Zionists, we have anti-Zionists, we have everybody, and everybody's welcome to come and discuss this. And I've been very vocal in saying that, as nice as that sounds, um, again, it's falling back on inclusion as an excuse. In a time of genocide, there is no wide tent. In a time of genocide, it is a time for asking the essential ethical question: which side are you on? And so that is the current state as I see it in the Jewish community. I feel very blessed that I have been able to participate in the upbuilding of anti-Zionist Jewish community, both in my congregation, but also together with Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist Jewish organization that has, tens of thousands of members and is chapters around the United States and also um, very active politically on Capitol Hill and is a genuine force to be reckoned with. There are other anti-Zionist Jewish ritual spaces that are popping up all over the country. They contact me all the time because Tzedek Chicago, my congregation, is one of the older ones, being 11 years old. We're in a position to kind of mentor other communities that are getting started. But I hear from these, particularly young people, but not only. I hear from them all the time, all the time. My inbox is full. My inbox is full of Jewish individuals who say, I belong to this congregation and the things coming out of my rabbi's mouth, I just can't take anymore when it comes to Israel. And I don't know what to do. And you know, um, is there a congregation near me where I can be my full ethical Jewish self? And, it is a burgeoning movement, but the hard truth, I think, is that the Jewish legacy organizations, the big Jewish organizations, have incredible amounts of resources and are incredibly robust and widespread around the community. And those of us who are creating this emergent movement are really just getting started, and it's hard to know where it's going to lead. But we're in the midst of a paradigm shift right now, I believe, and I don't think and Judaism and Jewish life will ever be the same as a result of this moment that we're in. Um, uh, but if someone asked me, well, this new Jewish movement you're talking about, I mean, is it just like going to be a dissident movement? Are you going to be just an alternative? to the quote unquote mainstream? And my answer to that is always absolutely not. I I'm not. I don't think any of us are content to be sidelined to dissident status. We are dissident, but we want to bring down this hegemony. We want to replace it with something that is equitable, that is rooted in values of solidarity and the rights of all, and a Judaism that is not rooted in militarism and ethno-nationalism, but it is rooted in liberation of people who are subject to state violence, whether it's in Palestine or anywhere else in the world. Um, so that is those are the core values of our congregation, and they're the core values one way or another, however they're articulated, with many of these new emergent communities that we're seeing. But right now, that divide is very, very real, and it's very, very painful, and it's manifest in many different ways. Uh, I'll just end with two final points. One of the effects of this abyss, this divide, is that it is not only dividing the community, it is also dividing families. It is, and this is something that I get contacted about all the time as well. I call this, for lack of a better term, I call this my pastoral political counseling, um, where I hear from people who are becoming estranged from family members. I hear from people who say, you know, I literally heard from someone who say my father, who taught me the ethical values that I've lived by my whole life, is saying things now about Palestinians that I can't even believe are coming out of his mouth. And I don't know what to do because it's drawn a wedge between us. I've heard from people say, we've been hosting Passover Seder's at our house for years and years. And, last year we got into such an argument over the issue of Zionism in Israel that I'm not sure I even want to celebrate Passover anymore. This holiday that just seems to all just commemorate Jewish liberation, but doesn't pay any attention to the ways that Jews have become Pharaoh in through Zionism, and how do I talk to my loved ones? How do I even cultivate a relationship to Judaism itself when this kind of heinousness is being perpetrated in the name of Judaism? It's causing a great deal of alienation within our Jewish community. And again, I've been doing my best to counsel members of our community through this, but I'm also well aware that in a moment of genocide, the first order of business is not, the angst that is felt in the Jewish community, as real as it is and as important as it is to address. The most important thing is that every single day, um, Palestinian families, children, journalists, first responders are being shot down and bombed as we speak, and we know this. We know this because Palestinians themselves are reporting on their own genocide. And in a time of genocide, um, the first order of business is doing everything we can to end it. And I believe that to my core as a Jew, but even more as a human being of conscience. Um, I'll end with one final thought. And this is a question I often get asked, which is that, well, you call yourself an anti-Zionist Jew, but that just tells me what you're against. Well, what are you for? What do you support? And I think that's a really important question. And you know, what I would say to that is that I call myself an anti-Zionist because we live in a time in which Zionism, which is a form of structural oppression, is hegemonic. And just like a person living amidst in a racist society will refer to themselves as anti-racist, I think it's enormously important to use the term anti-Zionist when you live in a time where Zionism has become normalized, particularly as a Jewish person. I think it's important to use that term. Now, that's not all I am. It's an important value in this particular time in which I'm living. But there's much more to being Jewish than this one particular issue. I just got finished leading our Shabbat morning service, and for those who came in, most 90% of it would be like any other Jewish service. We are, but it's an important community for us because we know we can come together and know that the people around us are values aligned with one another on the most important ethical issues that they cherish. Um, the other thing I would say to that is that, um, and this goes back to Molly Crabapple's book, everywhere we live is our homeland. Um, Judaism, and I think I intimated this earlier on. Judaism has always been rooted in the diaspora. Judaism itself came into being because of the diaspora. After the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, Judaism, as we know it, rabbinic Judaism, Pharisaic Judaism, uh, truly began, and it became a spiritual system that could be observed anywhere in the world. It wasn't dependent on the temple in Jerusalem anymore. It wasn't geographically specific. It didn't um, require you to live in or around the temple to be able to worship and bring your sacrifices. It became a religion of prayer and ethical behavior, and where God could be found anywhere in the world that you lived. And that was to me, that was the birth, not just to me, that was the birth moment, the origin story of Judaism itself, but also to me, the genius and the beauty of this tradition, which is that in a time of cataclysm, it could respond not with surrender, but with embitterness or assimilation, but rather with creativity and hope that the essence of who you are could be continued in a radically new way. And that radical new way was learning how to live in the diaspora and to adapt to whatever community you happen to live anywhere in the world. And that diasporic mentality, which is that wherever we live is our homeland, um, is something that, as an anti-Zionist, we are trying to, I and we are trying to reclaim and lift up, which is something that's always been what it meant to be Jewish, but in this day and age, it needs to be in the day and age where Judaism is synonymous with Zionism. It needs to be reasserted in no uncertain terms. And in fact, just this past week, over 40 organizations, including my congregation, um, uh, announced the beginning of what we call the Jewish diaspora movement. And if you go online, you can find the website for the JDM, um, in which we are trying to create a movement of anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, or even if they don't specifically refer to them that way, that see Judaism as not rooted in an ethno-nation state in historic Palestine, but rooted in a more universal vision of being Jewish in the global sense and finding common cause with other peoples who live in their diasporas. Um, so that is a very exciting development that's just emergent as we speak, and I know that we're only going to be growing because I know that these groups are being founded every day. I learn about them all the time, and I've mentored many of them, many of the leaders in them. So I know I've covered a lot of ground, threw a lot at you, and maybe rambled a little bit. I'm not sure, but I think what I will do now, because it's a quarter to the hour, is allow you the opportunity to, and I noticed that there's been some chit chat going on in the chat box. So if anyone wants to share something that's been shared there or have a question of their own, I'm happy to turn things over now to Janet to facilitate.
Thank you, Brant. There are lots of questions. I would say there are more questions during this forum than there ever have been. So you have elicited a lot of thought, and that is always what we're aiming to achieve. So I thank you for that. Before I start the questions, I would say that the Christian church is going through much the same um, struggles with this issue as the Jewish. No doubt not to the extent and to the extreme the Jewish faith is going through, but even mainline churches, not even just Christian nationalist churches, there's this plethora of views, and the term "it's too complicated" to even approach the topic. And that is what's so frustrating. And I would venture to say that we have a lot of people nodding their heads in our audience. So that having been said, I will start with the questions. And here we go. All right. What percentage of Jews in Israel are anti-Zionist? We want an exact number too, Brent. Just kidding.
Infinitesimal. Um, I know many of them. Maybe I know all of them. No, I have many Israeli friends who are anti-Zionist, and it is very, very difficult to be anti-Zionist in Israel. But every poll that you read, uh, shows, I mean, not only support for the current government, but I think even a more fundamental level, support for the wars that have been going on. And Zionism is a founding ideology of that state, So it takes a great deal of courage to be an anti-Zionist Israeli. I don't know if any of you saw recently, or if any of you watched Democracy Now!, but this past week, there was a really interesting debate between two Israeli academics, Omer Bartov and Gidon Levy. And
We
Omer
had
Bartov is
Omar a few months ago.
okay, right. Well, he was very interesting,
Yes.
Gidon Levy is an anti-Zionist, and he said as much. And you know, I think Omer is an example of someone who I have huge respect for, but you know, and I shouldn't say but, and uh, you know, described Israel in very similar terms. He described it as a form of ethno-nationalism, and but refuses to he comes to the brink, but doesn't really break with it. The name of his book is "What Went Wrong," and what went wrong was that this ideology of political supremacy was created in the first place. And so Guido Levy, I think, is a great example of, I don't know how he does it, how he writes these columns over and over and over. He's a very prophetic figure to my mind, because he just calls it as he sees it. But I would highly recommend that debate. It wasn't really a debate, they're very close. But Omer Bartov is an example of someone who just, for all kinds of complicated personal reasons, cannot make that break. It shows how deep
Yeah,
the identity of Zionism goes
yeah.
among
Uh,
Israelis.
and I would venture to say that there aren't many anti-Zionists in Israel, partly because they don't even get much of the truth in their news, and
Right.
it's
And they leave. The other thing is that they leave. They leave in
that's what I was
droves.
also going to say.
Yeah.
Many of them have
Yeah.
left. Yeah, exactly. Okay, these first questions had come in prior to your talk. I have ceased to have any hope, that is, any realistic hope, that anything can improve the Palestinian situation. Do you have hope?
I absolutely have hope. Uh, that's my answer.
All right,
I
let's
I
just
think
move.
I no,
Well,
I think I mean, look,
you're a rabbi.
um,
You better have hope.
yeah, no, I have Palestinian friends and colleagues and comrades who have hope, and if they have hope, then I cannot but have hope. It would, I think hope. It depends on how you define hope, and you know, I I don't think hope is the same thing as optimism. I think optimism is sort of a passive expectation that things will get better on their own. Um, Hope, there's the great abolitionist organizer Miriam Kaba, to my mind, famously said, "Hope is a discipline." In other words,
Mm,
hope is a form of action, and it's
yes,
a form of
yes,
action that you engage in, knowing that there are no guarantees in life.
yeah,
And you are not guaranteed anything, and things might not get better in your own lifetime, but they also might, because we know from history that dominoes can fall very quickly. And so I think hope comes in, it emerges out of the doing, and the doing we do because we don't have a choice. Those of us who really believe in the ethic of solidarity know that there, when I look at those who are participating in the global Sumud flotilla, um, you know, who there's going to be there are going to be hundreds more going there, even after what Israel did to the latest group. They're not going to stop. They're not going to stop because they have hope. That they understand that solidarity is rooted in a kind of hope that means that we act to create the world that we want to see. And that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. Next question. This person says, I need tips on how to talk about this with Jewish friends.
Um, you mean
It's
Jewish
quite,
friends who are Zionist, who are Zionists?
well, I would think where there's a
Um,
dissonance in agreement. Yeah.
I'm not the best person to ask that question to, because I don't think I have found in my experience that it is very on this issue. It's very difficult to um, dissuade someone from accepting something they're not prepared to accept. And what ends up happening is it devolves into a back and forth that doesn't do anybody any good. And so it depends on what is the goal of that conversation. Is it you're trying to win that person over to your side of thinking? I don't think that's going to happen,
Mhm.
in my experience. Is it that you want to kind of come to some kind of common understanding? As I said before, in a time of genocide, I don't think common understanding should be the goal. Um, so, there's no easy answer to that question. I frankly think that, I if this friend is a loved one, like a dear, dear friend who you can't imagine being estranged from, I would talk about anything else but this issue, to be honest. And I know that sounds like you're ducking something, but I don't see the point in engaging in a conversation that's not going to result in anything constructive. And the only thing that's going to be constructive on this issue is freeing Palestine and Palestinians.
And to that, I also say, come and see. You were there, you saw with your eyes. I think a lot of folks who are living on this side of the pond simply will not have the opportunity to have an understanding of what's really going on over there.
It's true, but then it has to be with they have to go there with the right group of
Oh,
people, they have
yes.
to, and they may or may not be open to doing that. They may say, well, I'm just going to get a one-sided view. So, everybody's got an answer. And in the short time I have left in my life, I feel like I don't want to get bogged down into these kinds of back and forths. That's own, my own feeling about it, at least.
All right, we'll move on. Um, I think the next question has kind of been answered, so I'm going to skip that. Yeah, this is a long thing. In South Africa, the end of apartheid was negotiated by the Nationalist Party, not the Progressive Federal Party. That example should show us that the end of Israeli apartheid will have to be negotiated with the Zionists in power. You think this is possible? Why or why not? Ooh,
Um,
are you a politician?
I mean, I don't think every political um, every moment of political transformation is identical. I think there are ways that Israel and South Africa are similar, but I think it's going to have its own trajectory. And I don't know. It's hard for me to predict um, how this transformation is going to take effect. Um, politically speaking, I don't know that we have any politicians who have the wherewithal to do what Botha did, for instance, when Mandela was freed. I don't know. I'm not a political scientist, but I do know that the way toward um, the this kind of transformation is external pressure. that Israel is not going to solve this on their own. They have to be forced from the outside, and that's what did happen in South Africa, by the way.
Yeah.
Israel was internationally isolated to the point where they had no choice, and that's what has to happen here. That the BDS movement has to double down. The flotilla has to double down. The the protests in the street and the political and economic isolation of the state of Israel has to increase. And beyond that, how that is going to play out, I know better than to say, but that's always been how change happens. Whether it's the civil rights movement in this country, or the fall of apartheid. That power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will.
Okay. A couple of these are my own questions. Is the Sidis, I want to start with this one. Does the Tzedek congregation skew younger? I'm curious.
Um, and actually, maybe because I'm an old fart,
Wouldn't say so.
I'm feeling that way more and more. So many of these groups do skew younger. We are pretty multi-generational, which I'm very proud of. And our new rabbi is 41. And I would say, certainly the younger generation is the most increasingly anti-Zionist, but we're an example of a multi-generational anti-Zionist congregation, and I'm going to work hard after June. I have some kind of role in the congregation, but one of them I definitely will have is trying to convince the older folk to stay, and continue to support the congregation, because I think it's a real source of our strength. Uh, um, so it is true that demographically most anti-Zionist Jews are younger, but there are many Jews of my generation and older who were socialized into Zionism, for whom it takes us a little bit longer to break with it, whereas younger people, they're growing up into a world where they see Israel and they say, I don't want any part of this.
Where is the congregation in the Chicago area?
We rent space where I'm speaking to you right now, from a Presbyterian church in Lakeview, which is on the north side. But we also, I should mention, we have a global membership. And during the pandemic, when we went online, one of the things that happened to us is that we surged in members literally from around the country and around the world, because of the nature of our congregation, that we're not the kind of congregation that most communities have access to. And when everything was on Zoom, they could just log in and join us like everybody else. And since that time, we you know we it's changed our community. And so our core is in Chicago, but we have people who join us literally from the West Coast to the East Coast. We have members in Europe. We have members in Southeast Asia. We have members in New Zealand. The time difference is a challenge, but we are truly we do everything we do is online, either hybrid or exclusively online.
The tiny silver lining of the pandemic, wasn't it? Our
Very, very, yeah,
organization has
yeah,
benefited from that as well. So,
yeah. It was a transformative year in so many ways for
yeah.
us. Yeah, in all manner of ways.
Um, Another question, is the citizen U.S. Jewish pushback that you have described reaching any of our lawmakers?
Yes,
And any of the
it is.
lawmakers who aren't already, um, you know,
It is. It
on the
is.
side of anti-Zionism?
If you look at some of the trends that we're seeing, uh, um, the latest bill to Israel, was almost completely supported by Democrats, and we're seeing Republicans now starting to break. Some of them not for the best reasons. We have some people who are to the right of MAGA, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, who are supporting Israel, but from a anti-Semitic white nationalist point of
Yeah,
view,
which is interesting.
which is interesting and disturbing.
Yeah.
But all that to say that what one of the overall effects it's having is that we're seeing Israel will never have the support on Capitol Hill that it's had up until now. It's eroding very, very quickly, and you know. I'm afraid to say that the Democratic Party has still not learned its lesson on this. That individual Democratic congresspeople and senators are, but the Democratic leadership. If you heard about the autopsy that they did, and the fact that the word Gaza was not mentioned once in 200-page autopsy of what went wrong in the election. So the Hakeem Jeffries and the
The
DNC
Chuck
leadership,
Schumers.
Chuck Schumer's, still are going to have to go. But rank and file, I think, is changing, and certainly among voters, it's changing.
The voters might vote in spite of all of them. We
Yes.
so anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
I don't know if go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm just going to say that I think if you look at polls on American attitudes toward Israel, they are completely at odds with the politicians in this country. Um, so that much is clear, and that's a different kind of abyss that I think is growing.
All right. Have you received threats personally because of your position?
Um, Not really. If I have, I haven't paid much attention to them. I don't really look at online boards and things like that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no, I have colleagues who have, but um, no. Other than, I mean, look, I had to leave my congregation under very difficult circumstances. And it's not to say that there haven't been consequences for having um, this opinion, for professing this opinion. But in terms of my own political safety, I had that's not something I've experienced.
I see one. Nope. Oh, goodness. Forget that these questions are so long. They're very involved. Okay, can you, no, you can't read these. Okay, here we go. I recently heard a lecture that talked about the term Hebrew as being related not to religion or ethnicity, but to being refugees, oppressed, unwanted, or those, quote, from the other side. So once a Hebrew comes to power and starts oppressing others, they are no longer Hebrew, and those currently being oppressed, for example, Palestinians, now become the Hebrews who need protection. Is this a fair and helpful understanding of the term Hebrew people? Have you heard this before?
Um, I mean, the word Hebrew is an English word that I think can be
Yeah.
used in lots of different ways. I think, um, in the Bible, if we're looking at the Bible, there's the term but what is in Hebrew, it's Bnei Israel, which literally means the children of Israel. Which is often translated as Israelite, and which are kind of, the Exodus story is about the enslavement of the Bnei Israel, of the Israel. Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, and the Israelites are set free by God. And so the Israelites are kind of the paradigmatic oppressed people in Egypt by Pharaoh in that mythic story. Um, you know, um, I don't I don't use the term Hebrew that much. It's not one that's bandied about that much. I'm not sure that it's a particularly helpful term in the current context. I will say though that when I'm at a Passover Seder and I read the story about Pharaoh and the Israelites, that the only way that I can make sense of that story in the current moment is Israelites, and that the Israelites in that story can be any people who are oppressed by state violence, and the parallels are fascinating because Pharaoh at the beginning of the Exodus story is the new Pharaoh, the one that didn't know Joseph, is threatened by the demographic growth of the Israelites, and so he enacts oppressive policies to curb their growth, which is has disturbing parallels to the political reality in uh, Israel today, which is again, it's a state that's predicated on the majority of one people over another, and so engages in all kinds of demographic engineering to maintain that majority. So, there are ways that we can use the story in kind of a mythic sense to understand the current politics of our time. But the term Hebrew is not one that is as familiar or as common to me, I think, in the circles I travel in.
Okay, next question. Do you agree with Joseph Massad that Zionism is a Protestant, parentheses, Reformation response, Protestant, in the term of a small p,
Hmm.
I think, response to
Yeah.
a burgeoning Jewish question that was always anti-Jewish? Zionism does not come from Zion. It is a European anti-Jewish project.
Um, I, I Yes, I believe it is absolutely true that Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism considerably, uh, and it is rooted in uh, a uh, a millennialist worldview that I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, which is yes, which is. Uh, in at its core very anti-Semitic in terms of its attitude toward Jews. And I think when Herzl um, was knew about Christian Zionists, and very Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of the modern Zionist movement in the late 19th century. Um, Reverend William Hexler, for instance, who was a British Christian Zionist, was someone that Herzl was close to, and it was kind of a Faustian bargain that the Jewish Zionists made with Christian Zionists. I think they knew full well who Christian Zionists were, but they Christian Zionists have always greatly outnumbered Jews, so their support was very important, and we see a direct line from that to the current moment and with Netanyahu's embrace of Christian Zionists. Um, so I'm not sure I'd have to read the whole article by Mossad to put it in context, but yeah, I do believe that Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism, and that it is rooted in an anti-Jewish uh, mindset that is not healthy for Jews or for anybody for that matter.
Next point and question. Thank you for your this is what is written. Thank you for your judgment regarding the fence that cannot be straddled and the gap that cannot be bridged. Would you comment on the AFSC apartheid-free pledge? Do you support it?
Yes, in fact, my congregation was one of the first Jewish organizations to take the pledge. And I'm very, very I'm still very active with AFSC, and I think the apartheid-free program that they're doing is enormously, enormously important. And so, yes, I'm very supportive of it. And by the way, for people who are uh, interested in ongoing updates about what's going on in Gaza, AFSC does this invaluable service every Friday at 11 Central, 12 Eastern. There is what they call the Gaza, I think it's the Power Hour, which is online on Zoom. And if you go to AFSC's website, you can find out a way. But they always give updates. Uh, um, they have amazing speakers and then advocacy opportunity. I highly recommend. And the apartheid free has been featured on during that hour more than once. So I definitely recommend that organization organizations take that pledge and are visibly associated with it. Yeah,
I just
thanks,
put it
Jen.
in the chat.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, now I have to find my questions again. Here we go. Could you comment about the role of such groups as Abraham Initiatives and New Israel Fund in the overall mix of things, and with American Jews in particular?
Um, those are liberal Zionist, initiatives, and kind of coexistence initiatives. And I'm very familiar with them because I used to be very involved with them, in my previous life. um, but they're all predicated on this notion that, of coexistence within an inequitable, unjust, oppressive system. And, they're all ultimately based in a kind of a Zionist assumption uh, that the system does not need to be dismantled; it just needs to be reformed. And that's why I'm not a supporter of groups like the New Israel Fund, because um, as laudatory it is to be an advocate of coexistence. Coexistence that's taking place in an unequal context is not real coexistence. It's like if you were um, starting an initiative in the Jim Crow South that brought black kids and Jewish kids together, um, but did nothing about dismantling Jim Crow, uh, then you're just kind of tweaking around the edges, but not dealing with root causes. And
Kind of
I
like the
think groups
separate
like
but equal, kind of like separate but equal. They were trying to,
yeah, yeah, and it's
it never
I think
is
it's
separate
important to
but never
have
equal.
right. You need a systemic analysis of
Right,
oppression.
right.
It's the same. It's same with
That's my point.
anti-black racism in this country as well. And yeah,
All right. We have our folks are hanging in there with us, so I'm going to keep. I have a couple more questions if we're good. Is the New Israel Fund truly an organization working for justice and peace in Israel, or is my caution concerning this organization well-founded?
it's like I would refer you to what I just said about my
Great.
previously. It's not an
So,
organization I would recommend personally
okay,
for
we'll leave it
those
at that.
reasons. Yeah.
What is the difference between non-Zionist and anti-Zionist?
Great. Thank you for asking that.
It's the last question.
Non-Zionist is a neutral term. It just says what you're not, but when you say you're not Zionist, it just means, that you're not taking a stand one way or the other. But when you say you're anti-Zionist, it means, again, going back to the structural analysis, that you understand that Zionism is a structural form of oppression that needs to be dismantled and transformed into something else. Um, you know, um, Angela Davis very famously said, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. And that's, I think, to me, the best answer to what's the difference between non and an anti-Zionist. A non-Zionist says, well, that's just not who I am. An anti-Zionist is taking active measures to do something about it.
Passive versus active
Yeah.
in one's
Yes. Yes.
in how one lives one's
Yeah.
life. All right, let me just,
Right.
I think we're good with the questions. I don't want to eat up too much time here. I think we're good. And
Okay.
all right, so it's time to thank you. And I do thank you. You have been very open. It's clear that this issue is a hot one for Christians, Jews, and everyone in between. And it's always helpful to know that there are folks who are looking at it and with clear eyes. So we thank you for that.